Right, we are going to read chapters 29 and 30. Meanwhile, Antonio had bent down and picked up a small rusty pin. Antonio, give me that pin, Francisco demanded. We don't need you to scratch yourself now. Francisco stood beside them, and as he leaned against the pillar, he began to scratch a little picture into the plaster surface. Why do you get to use the pin and I don't? Antonio complained. Because I'm older and I'm more careful, Francisco explained. What are you drawing? Antonio demanded, jumping up to get a closer look. The most beautiful goat in Italy, Francisco said softly as he continued to draw. But you've given her wings, Antonio observed. Goats don't have wings. It's what I wish for her, Francisco said. With wings, she could fly to America. Come, Dominic, Antonio called. Come see Francisco's funny drawing. Come see Violeta with wings. Dominic looked at the drawing and smiled. It's good, he said. She's not eating anything. Francisco smiled too. He was about to draw something for her to eat when the line suddenly lurched forward and they found themselves moving through the big doors. Antonio covered his ears with his hands, for the dim voices in the hall were deafening. The great swell of sound echoed off the walls and bounced around them as people were talking, laughing, crying, and yelling in different languages all at once. Dominic's eyes searched the empty walls as he began to climb the grand staircase. Gone were the photographs, gone were the displays. There were no tourists with cameras or gift shops or computer screens. There were just people, lots of people. It was as though all of the photos and displays from the museum had suddenly come to life. Dominic and the others stared wide-eyed at the strange assortment of faces and clothing. When they had finally reached the first deck, the inspector had to look over their papers. He tried talking to them in English. Dominic was stunned to realize that as hard as he tried, he couldn't remember a single word of the language. It was as though he had never known it. I don't speak English, Francisco told the inspector. Do you speak Italian? Francisco asked the man. The man shook his head no and called for an interpreter to help them. Then he pointed to the names on the ticket and spoke again in English, in words the boys could not understand. The interpreter, who knew English and Italian, translated it for them. Cantori brothers, go to the next line, he said. Cantori, Dominic whispered. Why did he say Cantori? How does he know my name? Francisco tried to explain to the man. My name is Candino. We're the Candino brothers. The man took their tickets and showed them where the shipping agent had written their names. Antonio Cantori, Salvador Cantori, and Francisco Cantori, the man read aloud. Cantori. What happened to Candino? Francisco asked. The interpreter shrugged. Shipping agent must have wrote Cantori. That's your name now. Dominic stared as chills shot up his spine. But that's not our name, Francisco cried. Maybe not in Italy, the interpreter explained, but here in America, it is. Things are not like they were back in Italy. You've crossed the ocean. You're Americans now. Francisco thought this over. Cantori, he whispered, rolling the name over his tongue. I'm an American. I'm a Cantori. That's my name, Dominic cried. Yes, now it can be your name too, Francisco agreed. No, you don't understand. His voice trailed off into a whisper as he caught sight of the glint of the gold peeking out from under Francisco's shirt. It was Salvador's key. The key that would one day be his own. S.C., Dominic whispered the initials. He knew well under his breath. Suddenly, he began to understand. If Francisco's name was now Cantori, and if he kept the key to give to his son, and that son gave it to his son, and eventually came to Dominic, then could that mean that Francisco was Dominic's great-grandfather? Chapter 30. Dominic stared at Francisco. He could see the resemblance now. Francisco's eyes were the same color and shape as his own. They both loved animals, and they had the same laugh. Why didn't he recognize it before? My great-grandfather, he thought. He longed to tell Francisco all about it, but he knew that Francisco would think he was crazy or sick in the head from the earthquake. Meanwhile, Antonio had to go to the bathroom, and Francisco was ready to take him outside when a man behind them told them about the indoor toilets. Dominic was to keep their seats until they returned. But as he watched them walk away, an odd fear surprisingly gripped him. Maybe he should go after them. Maybe he shouldn't let them go out of his sight. Now that he had found them and he knew who they really were and who he was to them, Dominic wanted them to stay close by. He waited anxiously for them to return, and when they finally did, Dominic sighed with relief. As they stepped forward in line, they heard a woman in front of them talking about the Italian Aid Society. She pointed to a table where people were crowding around. They help you find the people that you're to meet, the woman was saying. Dominic and Francisco looked at the table and then at each other. They both knew that their time together was coming to an end. Francisco, Dominic began. Yes, Francisco answered. I don't know. Dominic fumbled for the right words. He felt suddenly embarrassed and lowered his eyes to the floor. It's just that everything is happening so fast, he blurted out. And soon you'll be off in New Jersey and I might not see you for a while. Francisco nodded his head as if he understood. Dominic looked up to meet his large, dark eyes that matched his own. I'll never forget you, Dominic whispered. All of you. And I hope you won't forget me. Forget? Francisco smiled. Who could forget family? He reached out to hug Dominic. And this time, for the first time, Dominic hugged him back. What about me? Antonio squeaked. Dominic grinned and bent down and gave him a big hug, too. I bet you won't even recognize me the next time you see me, Dominic, Antonio announced. No? Why not? Because I'm going to eat so much food here in America that I will look as if you're made like a mushroom? Dominic finished his sentence. The three boys stood silent for a second and then all began to laugh as they wrapped their arms around each other in one giant hug. They stood in line for a long time, until it had stopped moving altogether. People had begun to sit on their suitcases and bundles. Dominic was glad that the line wasn't moving. They hadn't slept much the night before, and he hadn't eaten in hours, and all of the excitement of landing left them exhausted. Dominic and Antonio slumped down against the back of a large basket beside a woman who was nursing a baby. It felt so good to sit, Dominic decided not to get back up until he had to. He felt his eyes begin to droop. Dominic watched as Antonio tapped his grimy fingers over a brightly painted red and yellow flowers of his instrument. The baby in the mother's arms beside them began to fuss, and Antonio offered to play a lullaby to help calm him. The song was so soothing that Dominic found it hard to keep his eyes open. Just a little nap, he mumbled, as his head had fallen against his chest. He thought he heard Francisco call his name over the din of voices and the soft melody of Antonio playing, and then he heard nothing at all. We will read chapters 31 and 32 tomorrow.